How you doing? Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Amoja Ajabu, and I guess I just represent concern. We're living in a very grave time. And I have to speak of this from a personal view because you understand things from the experiences that you have. And right now I'm in seminary and I'm studying a thing called process theology. And when you talk about the process, they say that the art of creation or creation came out of confusion. In the beginning was chaos. And the act of God was to take this chaos and to put it in order. I say that this is the act of civilization, and actually the people who are moving things from chaos to order are the children of God. When I look at what's happening today, we don't know who the next president's going to be. We don't know who's going to control the Senate. We don't know whether we're going to kill someone innocent trying to get at someone guilty. It's too much confusion. There's too much chaos. And we have to bring ourselves out of this confusion, out of this chaos. And this is the reason why this committee exists. To bring civility to this state in which we live. Now, my personal history could probably point to creating some of the chaos that exists. Because I had picked up a weapon. And with that weapon, I said, okay, I'm going to make some order. And if some people had to die in the process, then so be it. But rethinking that stance, I've put down that weapon, that AK-47, and I picked up another weapon. And this is a weapon that not only calls, with that AK-47, I could take someone's life, but with this Bible, with this book, I'm saying that I'm willing to give my life to save a life. I'm asking and praying, even pleading, with this committee to be an agent to take us out of the confusion to where it's that we might kill someone innocent thinking that they're guilty. And I'm saying that the possibility exists because we as a people, we're fallible. We make mistakes. Obviously, even though the system that we live in is touted as being the best system in the world, it makes mistakes. Who in the world would have thought that this time, 48 hours after the election, we were still trying to decide who the president is going to be? Because of the system. The system makes mistakes. And in this situation that we're talking about now, if we make a mistake, then we kill someone for something that they didn't do. So the bottom line, so I don't run over my 5 minutes, is to ask this committee to put down the animosities, to put down what history has dictated the law should be, to put down killing, and to bring up life so that we can take ourselves out of chaos and bring ourselves into order. Thank you.
Thank you. speaker will be Representative Bill Crawford. And Bill, congratulations on your re-election.
Thank you very much.
I would like to mention one thing, and that is what we're interested in hearing is comments on the evidence that we've already taken, although I do not intend to stop anybody from saying them in the law, so long as they're within the time frame. Bill, you had some material you'd like passed out?
Yes, Senator.
And why don't we do that?
While that's going around, Senator, thank you very much, members of the committee. I'd like to take advantage of an opportunity to share with you. Let me say at the outset that as a member of the Indiana General Assembly, I have historically been in a posture of opposition to capital punishment and support the abolition of capital punishment throughout the state of Indiana. In reading our state constitution, it says that our penal code should be based on reformation and not vindictive justice. I see no possibility of earthly reformation through the imposition of capital punishment. And in that context, I would support efforts to declare a moratorium in Indiana. Having said that, however, I recognize that as a matter of public policy, we do have capital sentencing as a part of our criminal code here in the state of Indiana. And what I've passed to you is one way that I had, and this was legislation that was introduced in the 1999 session of the Indiana General Assembly. It was debated and voted upon, and I put the roll call vote at the very end of the packet of information so that you can see the closeness of the issue. The legislation failed for lack of a constitutional majority, and there were 47 votes in favor of the legislation I introduced and 46 against it. So you can see that in the Assembly there was still a close issue. But it dealt with the question of if we're going to have capital punishment, not whether or not it's fair, can we make it fairer? You know, there are degrees of fairness, not just that it's fair, but can it be fairer? And in many jurisdictions, Larry, I believe the federal courts, they misplaced my file when I went through the State House this morning. I couldn't find it. But I had data on all the states in the federal system that requires, before the imposition of a capital sentence, a unanimous jury verdict. A unanimous jury verdict. If we're going to have capital punishment, and we're going to rely upon the will of the people of the state of Indiana, and I would submit to you that it's a win-win situation. If 12 people can unanimously agree that the person deserves death, and that recommendation, it becomes not a recommendation, but something that the judge would be required to adhere to the wishes of the constituency. That seems to make more sense to me. And so that's what this legislation did. It required a unanimous verdict. If the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, the judge could impose life without parole or another appropriate sentence, but could not put a person to death. And so I think that that makes it fair, and that's during the sentencing process, during the trial phase. The other thing that I will share with you that I intend to do, but I will even delay that if this committee is willing to look at it, is the whole issue. On October the 6th, I had a discussion with a judge from the state of Oregon who talked about Indiana and our guilty but mentally ill sentencing option. And it doesn't make much sense to me for us to determine that a person is guilty but mentally ill at the time of the commission of the act, and then conceivably we will get the person well to execute them. And so I'm going to introduce legislation that would, and I was a part of the effort that would, we could not charge a person who is obviously mentally retarded with a capital crime. That I'm going to try to do the same thing for a person in the sentencing phase who has been determined is mentally ill at the time of the commission of the act. I asked LSA to draft that legislation. If I get some indications that this commission is willing to look at that, I might, just delay that. But I do have the option that I delivered the body to do that. So it's not the question that I'm here today. I oppose it. I hope that we declare a moratorium on it, but at least let's look at particular techniques that we can make it fair. We have death qualified jurors in Indiana. You cannot sit on the jury if you state that you're opposed to the capital punishment. So giving those jurors, those death qualified jurors, the option of saying, agreeing unanimously that a person needs to be put to death, I think makes the system a little bit fair. I commend you on your work, and you're tackling a tough issue, and I know many of you around the table, and I know that you're sincere in that, and you have my empathy and sympathy, but I'm not sitting with you. But I hope that your deliberations go well.
No.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the bill that you passed out also has a victim impact statement. Is that part of your position also?
Yes, that was not the original part of the introduced bill, but it was an amendment, and I accept that.
You accept it, or no, you're advocating?
I would advocate it. It's again, that's fairness in the process.
Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker will be, is that Karen Burkhardt, is that right?
Yep.
Karen, could you say your name and where you're
Okay. I'm Karen Burkhardt, the Indiana Death Penalty Abolition Coordinator for Amnesty International. Senator Alexa and members of the Criminal Law Study Commission, thanks for giving me the opportunity to address you. Amnesty International opposes the death penalty under all circumstances. Even if it were possible to create a judicial system entirely free from bias, the punishment of death would still violate the most fundamental of all human rights. Each death sentence is an affront to human dignity, the ultimate form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment. Every execution deepens the culture of violence. We have all heard the testimony given before this committee, the deleterious effects the death penalty is having on our criminal justice system, how jurors have difficulty adjusting after sentencing a person to death, the judge being overburdened with the requirements of capital trials, prosecutors making the decision whether to pursue death, sometimes by considering factors as the cost of the trial, the desires of the victim's family members, and the quality of the attorneys representing the defendant, factors outside the aggravating factors identified by our legislature. Thus far, the death penalty has tainted everyone it has touched. I'm very concerned that the commission meeting ended abruptly on the prosecutorial discretion before deciding to investigate which death-eligible homicides are chosen to be prosecuted as death penalty cases. I think this study is important. Indiana prosecutors seek the death sentence in only a small fraction of eligible cases for reasons that are highly variable. Out of roughly 500 homicides per year, prosecutors seek death in 19 cases, which result in 1 execution per year. This is on average. This unbridled discretionary power in the preliminary stages of capital prosecution is an obvious source of racial discrimination. I am not suggesting all those who administered the death penalty are overtly racist. Some prosecutors strive to make decisions on the laying of charges in a racially neutral manner. However, given the overall absence of objective standards for filing charges, the idea prosecutors can always isolate themselves from racial divisions that affect our society is simply not credible. This concern is highlighted by the study conducted in Marion County from 1979 through 1988 on charging in death-eligible homicides by Dr. Melfi and Zhao, focusing on 187 solved homicide cases in which the victims were either black or white. They found a disparity between the proportion of white victims in cases in which the death penalty could be sought, 55.6%, and the proportion of white victims in cases in which the death penalty was sought, 82.1%. The odds of the death penalty being sought in cases involving white victims was 3.7 times higher than the odds of the death penalty being filed in cases involving black victims. Is this a random occurrence? Not hardly. Nebraska has hired consultants to study the fairness of the imposition of the death penalty, and Illinois has hired David Baldus to study racism and its use of the death penalty. Apparently, Governor O'Bannon isn't alone in his concern for fairness and lack of racism in the imposition of the death penalty. An investigation into which death-eligible homicides are chosen to be prosecuted as death penalty cases needs to be conducted. Concerns about racial disparity have been raised to the Commission, but action is yet to be taken. Is the death penalty being imposed in a race-neutral manner? The data presented thus far says no, at least not for the short time in Marion County. I believe a statewide study of the issue needs to be completed in order to answer the governor's question. I know I have limited time, but I also support Bill Crawford's request for a moratorium. Thanks for your consideration of this matter.
I might add that the testimony or the parts of our study that we have undertaken have been so far related to process and procedure. Our staff is currently involved in gathering information on the cost differential between this and life in prison without parole, and perhaps more importantly, a review of all of the people who are in our prison system who were in with life without parole or some other serious sentence that were death eligible as well. So we will be reviewing what you're talking about, but we're not at that stage yet. Okay? Next speaker will be Blair. Is it Karsh?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Blair Karsh. I'm an active member of the Indiana Citizens to Abolish Capital Punishment, a local teacher, writer, author, and producer. I'm been to a lot of your meetings, and I thank the commission and the governor for putting a commission like this together and the opportunity for public testimony. My first comment would be I hope there's the opportunity for further testimony, and I hope an hour after work to bring more people here would be a suggestion, because the people that you'll see today probably inevitably speak for a lot of people, the emotions, the heart, the intellect that aren't here, and I thank you for listening to us. As a citizen, I ask, while this commission goes on, an immediate moratorium on the death penalty. The national trends and the trends in Illinois show that it's not a catastrophic move politically or for the state or for the commission. Our group recently put together a religious forum with about 10 religious leaders speaking publicly on their religion's views on the capital punishment, and it was attended by about 8 different religions, and all religions spoke eloquently about the abolition of capital punishment by their faith. Those people, many of them, were invited here today, and the things that make them unavailable to come here today, politically and personally, are probably a lot of the same things that I find this commission lacking the fire and the passion to discuss such a sacred issue. As I come to this meeting, I see people on the committee that are abolitionists. I see a lack of color, and I also see a lack of real dialogue on that color, even in my opinion, by some of the minorities on the commission, and the politics and the balance that make it hard to publicly and passionately tell the public what you're about. Personally, is a balance in politics, and I understand that. But I believe as this commission, you have to do the right thing and not the correct thing. I think with the amount of people that vote in Indiana, quite often you cater to your constituents. I don't know how often you cater to your constituents that don't vote and think about those people that are not part of getting you elected. So often the situations that make capital crime happen are so physiological, the prenatal issues, and I hope that you bring doctors, sociologists, and psychologists in to testify about the reality of what makes murder and capital crime such a popular thing in America. As a school teacher, one of the '1 subjects that my kids want to talk about is murder, and our society has a little problem with murder, and I hope that you guys are think a little bit bigger, to think about the problems that invade our culture, our kids, our youth, our minority population, and understand that executing people is going to just continue the problem. I think all of our time could be better served here talking about why people murder and why people drink and do drugs and have children that are predisposed to such terrible lives that would make them absorb the culture that we live in and perpetuate killing human beings. It's sad that kids want to talk about it, but it's obvious they want to talk about it because they're bothered with it. And I hope after school meeting with public testimony would be something you'd consider, and bring our youth in here who through my speaking and working with them, 95% of our young people do not believe in capital punishment. A friend of mine who's an activist was speaking to a politician, and the politician said to him, "How many of them are you?" And as you look at the group of people here today, you wonder how many of us are there? How many people do we represent? And I can tell you, we represent a lot more than you can imagine, and we probably represent a majority. If you have the guts through this commission to lead and do things that you think in the short term might be politically incorrect. As I said, I thank the commission. I hope the moratorium, while this commission is studying the death penalty, is something that you consider, and you consider right now, not 2 weeks or 2 days before another soul has to go through the logistics and the politics of this people. Human life is too sacred, and it's very rare that a citizen like me gets to speak to people like you that have the ability to save life. And it's an honor to do that, and I hope it's an honor for you guys to listen. Thank you.
The opportunity. My name is Jack Davis. I'm from Noblesville, Indiana. I'm with the Indiana Friends Committee on Legislation, Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting, the Religious Society of Friends, and I'm on the National Board of the Friends General Conference. Another person that works with us is Mary Harder Mitchell, a professor of law of Indiana University, who couldn't be here, but I have a statement I'd like to read for her. November 9th, 2000. I attended the hearing at which you investigated the role of prosecutorial discretion to seek the death penalty. I listened carefully to the testimony of the invited prosecutors. I am also familiar with studies such as the one reported by Dean Norman Lefstein of the Indiana University Law School in Indianapolis, in which prosecutors were asked about the factors that influenced their decision whether to seek the death penalty. Consistently and understandably, prosecutors state that their decisions are influenced by the prediction as to whether the jury would be likely to recommend the sentence of death. In other words, they admit that they are influenced by the prospects of success. They are more likely to seek death if they think a jury will agree. This is the loophole through which prejudice and inconsistency slip into the process. Even the most conscious prosecutor attempting to make an impartial decision whether to seek death will, in considering how the jury will react to the case, necessarily take into account jury perception of the deathworthiness of the case. That perception may be tainted by prejudice or other factors not legally allowed or indeed strictly disallowed. Among the cultural prejudices, they may thereby slip into the decision-making process, and perhaps the worst among them is racial prejudice. So long as racial prejudice persists in the community, so long will racial prejudice enter into the decision to seek the death penalty by any prosecutor, considering the likely reaction of the jury drawn from the very community. While this may be an inevitable risk in society that values both prosecutorial discretion and juries, it is too great of a risk to run with when the stakes are life and death. The testimony you have collected shows that the system now incorporates society's prejudices into the very heart of have a tough time with that word, prosecutorial decision-making, infecting the process from the very beginning. Although I understand that your self-limited task is to explore ways to improve the death penalty in Indiana, I would respectfully assert that the full consideration of the many ways in which the death penalty both is and must inevitably be infected with the flaws and prejudices of society in which it operates should lead to the conclusion that there is no fair, humane, or reasonable remedy short of abolition of the death penalty. And again, that was from Mary Mitchell. And in discussing this at Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting and talking about the different aspects and a lot along the line of this, we came up with a minute for you folks. At its 180th session, October 2nd through the 6th, 2000, at Earlham College, Richmond, Indiana, Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting approved the following minute. Friends are opposed to capital punishment because it is contrary to the divine law of love. The application of the death penalty is brutalizing and degrading to the public mind. It leaves no room for reformation of character, nor for the revision of sentences in the event of a miscarriage of justice, which comes from our Book of Discipline, Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting, Religious Society of Friends, 1978. At our 180th annual session of Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting, 8th month, we reaffirm our position to the death penalty as stated in our Book of Discipline. We urge the representatives of our government and officials to take immediate steps to terminate the practice of punishment by death and live in accordance with God's law. Thou shalt not kill. It has been a move in Indiana to have the 10 Commandments somewhere put up so that we can see them as we come in and out of the thing. And I hope they do that, because every time the people that support the death penalty walk in, I hope they look at it. There is one there that says, thou shalt not kill. And I just wonder what part of thou shalt not kill did God not mean? Where is it in our hearts that we can't understand thou shalt not kill, those 4 words? Thank you very much, and I do appreciate your time.
Damon Muhammad.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, I bear witness there is but one God, the God of Abraham, Moses, Isaac, Jesus, and Muhammad. I'd like to greet the committee and those that are listening in the greeting words of peace of Assalamu alaikum. I'm Minister Damon Muhammad, the representative of Minister Farrakhan for the state of Indiana. We believe that the greatest of all gifts that one can receive is the gift of life. And this gift of life is great, not because of how long it is or because of how nice it is, but because this gift is in fact divine and sacred. And if life is a divine and a sacred gift given to you and me from the Creator, the only one that is qualified to sit as judge and executor of that life or taker of that life is someone that is in fact divine and sacred themselves. So if someone sits as judge over an individual that is not divine themselves, that is not sacred themselves, they're not qualified, in our opinion, to take that life or to issue a call for that life to be taken. Right now, there exists, according to the figures, 3,500 people that are currently on death row. It has been stated, and it is a fact, that 1 out of 7 of all of those that are on death row are in fact innocent. That means that 1 out of 7 of those that are on death row will be killed or murdered for something that they had nothing to do with. Let's suppose that we put a room of all the legislators. Let's suppose we filled a room with all the advocates for the death penalty and said that even though you are innocent, 1 out of 7 of you will die today for a crime that you did not commit. How many of us would be for the death penalty then, and how much justice would that be if that was to take place? In 1972, there was a call to stop or put an end to the death penalty. Why? In 1972, they made a inquisition and found out that those that were being chosen to die were being chosen on the basis of their skin color. In other words, they were being chosen because they were black. In 1972, racism was a justifiable means by which we could reach a moratorium. Well, in 1976, I guess they decided that racism did not exist anymore, and they reissued the death sentence or the death penalty. My thing, that in 1976, I was 2 years old, and I was born in racism. I live in the year 2000 now, 26 years old, and still exist in racism that is as thick as butter or as thick as mud that I could take a knife and stick it into it. So if racism was a justifiable means of reaching a moratorium in 72, and in 2000 racism still exists, then why is there not a moratorium today? So our position is that we believe that there is a certain things that happen in law that death can be issued for. But until people become divine and sacred, until people become perfect reflections of the image and the likeness of God and the way we were created, then we're not qualified to execute or implement that type of chastisement on a person or individual for whatever crime we think that they might be guilty of. There is a terrible internal murder that takes place when one is asked to kill someone. You and me consider legislatures and judges and whatnot, but what about those brothers and sisters, men and women that are in the room that have to make sure that the equipment work right? What about those that have to guard and secure and watch the life of another human being being snuffed away? What about those that have to see the brain of a human being fried, or to see a person's body break down? What about those that are in the room that had nothing to do with hearing the testimony? They weren't in the courtroom. They didn't hear the case, yet they are witnessing the murder of a fellow human being. We believe that the word brother, we are all brothers, and that the word brother comes from the word other, which means that your brother is your other self. So if, in fact, I'm looking at my fellow brother or my fellow sister dying in a victim before the people that have to look at it, and that we may develop a better and more civilized society. Racism still exists. If it was good enough in 72, it's good enough in 2000. Thank you.
Senator Bray and members of the commission, I thank you for this opportunity to address you. I'm sorry that I can't address the limited aspects of your concern regarding the death penalty today, but I did want to get on the record the position of my organization, Churchwomen United in Indiana. My name is Marion Town, and I reside at 5129 North Illinois Street in Indianapolis. I'm a volunteer ecumenical action coordinator for Churchwomen United in Indiana, which has more than 50 local and county units made up of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christian women in all parts of the state. While Churchwomen United has opposed the death penalty in any form or carried out by any means for 60 years in Indiana, we have in recent years become painfully aware of wrongful convictions, racism, and inadequate legal representation for those charged with capital crimes. We therefore urge a moratorium on the use of the death penalty in Indiana. Thank you.
I'm not an experienced attorney. I'm a law student, but I'm not experienced enough to address the specifics again of what this meeting might have asked to address. But I did want to come. I felt compelled as a citizen of Indiana to come and speak out against the death penalty. I don't represent any organization. I'm not affiliated with anyone. I just feel that there is a large segment of the citizens of Indiana that are adamantly opposed to the use of the death penalty in our names. And I wanted to get on the record to say that I am not. I'm not for the death penalty. I think many of us think that our greatest fear, and we've heard this addressed today, is the execution of an innocent person. And it's obvious, given the statistics, that is happening without a doubt. And that itself is a sombering thought, and I think we all need to just sit with that for a second. But it's also been addressed or stated that the fear isn't just for innocent. The fear is the execution of any person, convicted criminal or not. That in itself is a problem. It is fundamentally wrong to plan out and execute any person, whether convicted or not, whether convicted according to the proper fair statutes or not, especially when there are viable and remediable options. There are alternatives to execution that could be remedied after the fact. I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind. Again, I fear that executions are increasing our culture, the American culture of death. We've heard it spoken of, that this is a political issue that needs to be addressed. And I suggest it's not a political issue at all, that this is a moral issue, fundamentally. And politics, it's a shame that politics has to enter into this, because then we're concerned more about constituency and votes and public sentiment. And that, I'm suggesting, is not what we should be looking toward. We should be looking inward at our own spirits. I think everyone, and I heard it alluded to earlier, suffers that is involved in any way with the death penalty. You have the people on the judges, the attorneys that are representing, that are agonizing over the life of a person. You have victims' families, the victim, him or herself, is suffered. The victims' families watching the arduous process taking place over years and years, and maybe 10, 15 years of agony, feeling like one day upon the execution of that person, they're going to feel some sort of peace, which of course won't happen. The only peace they would feel is if their loved one was back, and killing the person that killed their loved one won't have any bearing on that. The accused families themselves, the families of the defendants, are sitting there agonizing, watching the premeditated killing of their loved one. Granted, they may have even admitted to killing the crime, but there they are, the accused families, watching their loved one being executed deliberately by the state. And I, again, want to put this back on the record that I don't want that done in my name. Additionally, we've heard that the general public, as a general public, we're being hardened. I think it bears a lot on this issue that executions are generally committed around midnight. I think that speaks volumes to what the state feels is the role of the death penalty, that it should be something done in closed rooms without any public present, no reporters, no videotaping, no one's allowed to, autopsies often denied. I mean, this, if there's such strong public sentiment for the death penalty, then why aren't we doing this at 12 noon with Channel 6 News in there taping it, showing the public exactly what the state's doing in their names? Because I think once the public knew how horrific it is, there would be a great outcry against this sort of practice. Because again, it's being done in their names. So as a citizen of Indiana, I call for the abolition of the death penalty. I think a moratorium is not enough. A moratorium, as we just saw in '72, wasn't enough because it came right back. I think this should be abolished. I think, it's upon the senators of the House to call for a constitutional amendment, like they have in Michigan, for example. If the public will or the public will of this committee isn't strong enough to do that, then at least we can ask for is a moratorium. And then finally, I ask for a public viewing. I think executions should be aired publicly so that the public has a right to see what's being done in their name. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Commission, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Steve Schutte. I live here in Indianapolis, and I'm proud to be a deputy to Susan Carpenter, the Public Defender of Indiana. I would like to address the adequacy of Indiana's review process, and specifically, its inability to provide sufficient assurance that a person won't be executed for a crime he did not commit. At last month's meeting, you heard from a representative of the Public Defender's Office and from a representative of the Attorney General's Office about the stages of review once a person has been convicted and sentenced to die. I hope to add some real-life perspective to that process and its weaknesses. Suppose a man is charged with multiple murders. There are no eyewitnesses to the crime. but there is evidence pointing to his guilt. He presents his sister and his mother as his alibi witnesses. The jury accepts the state's version of events and finds him guilty. The judge sentences him to die. On his first appeal, the Indiana Supreme Court will pay literally no attention to the defense case. Their procedure for reviewing convictions limits them to a review only of the state's case. If there is some evidence that he committed the crime, and as I said in this hypothetical there is, then the convictions and the sentence will be affirmed. The next layer of review is state post-conviction. Once he reaches this stage, our condemned man now bears the burden of affirmatively showing that he is innocent. He cannot prevail if he merely shows that the state's case is flawed. That's what the trial is for. Suppose, though, our man is lucky enough to have an attorney who, in poring over tens of thousands of pieces of information, uncovers a report that the trial attorneys missed, a report of an eyewitness to the crime. Suppose the eyewitness saw a man, clearly not the condemned man, commit the crime. That evidence is presented at the state post-conviction hearing. But suppose our condemned man is not allowed to present evidence that members of the jury would have continued to hold reasonable doubt about his guilt if they had known of the eyewitness. Suppose he's not allowed to present evidence that he passed a polygraph examination, affirming that he's not guilty of these crimes. And suppose he's not allowed to compel answers from the man identified by the eyewitness. Is he still innocent? Of course he is. But can he prove that he is innocent without that evidence coming before the court? No. I know the answer to that question is no, because I represent that man. Obadja ben Yisrael is on Indiana's death row for a crime he did not commit. He comes ever closer to execution. Our review system, any review system conceived by, implemented by, and executed by mere humans, can never guarantee perfection. That's a harsh reality we must deal with when we incarcerate people, but it's an outrage and it degrades us all when we kill people who did nothing wrong. Obadja's mother and his sister and his brother and his 9-year-old daughter asked me to ask you to at least recommend a moratorium so that their loved one might not die for a crime he did not commit. Thank you.
Charles Kapori.
Thank you. My name is Charlie Kafori. I'm representing Indiana Citizens to Abolish Capital Punishment. I live in Indianapolis. I've discarded my remarks that I had prepared last night to discuss with you today because the prior 11 people to me that spoke more eloquently than I could possibly speak. I hope that you heard that there were 11 either abolitionists or near abolitionists speaking passionately on this issue. Your committee, through perhaps your leadership, perhaps the government, perhaps your own doing, has decided not to study whether or not the death penalty is effective and whether or not it's good public policy and whether or not it's good government. It's none of those things. The people that you've just heard said that. And I assume that there were going to be more following me. Like I said, I'm not an articulate speaker, I'm following 11 that are, and 11 that I think you should listen very carefully to, particularly the last one. There's a man on Indiana's death row, and I happen to think there's more than one who's innocent, who this state will probably try to kill in less than 5 years. If that happens, we're going to abolish capital punishment anyway because there's going to be an outrage. So you might as well do it now. Thank you.
My name is Desmond Ryan, and I'm the spokesperson for the Indiana Catholic Conference. And in a meeting of the board of directors of my conference, the members signed a letter that asked me to personally deliver to Governor Frank O'Bannon, asking for a moratorium and also calling for a study commission. It took the governor a few months to respond, but when he did, he detailed in a 4-page letter all of the things that the state of Indiana is doing to guarantee that, unlike other states, things that are happening in other states that probably couldn't happen in Indiana because of all of the rules and regulations that have been set in motion here in Indiana. And he says, and I quote, "The resulting revisions and safeguards adopted by the Indiana General Assembly and the Supreme Court of Indiana have gone far to ensure that we do not have the type of fundamental flaws in the administration of the death penalty that some states are experiencing." He also concluded in the letter that even though we have a very detailed process, at the end of this process, the governor could still act in case something surfaces throughout this whole process that raises some doubts about the innocence, guilt, or inequalities centering on the case. Archbishop Daniel Beekline, the general chairman of the Indiana Catholic Conference, wrote back to the governor on March the 10th, thanking him for calling for this commission and saying in essence that this is a step in the right direction, but raises a more important question from the point of view of the Catholic community. And that question is, does the state have to take a human life in order to protect its citizens? And I think the bottom line for us and for many of us is not only are we doing it in a fair manner, but do we have to do it at all? I had the privilege of staying with you over the last 3 months and listening to the testimony of persons representing the system, judges, prosecutors, and even jurists. And I must say I was impressed with the dedication and commitment of these people in the efforts they're called upon to do in our name. What I was left with were a few points, and these are personal. Number one, I was impressed with what I saw was the fact of how disruptive the process is to the justice system, especially in a small county. Evidently, the judge in Johnson County, reacting to one of your questions, said that it distorts all other things that she has to do when she dedicates time to this important case. And the other thing that seemed obvious to many of you, and because many questions were asked, is the extreme cost of the process. And if I heard it correctly, that cost factor is a determining factor on whether a prosecutor would even call for the death penalty, especially in some smaller counties. And that raises some doubts as to whether it matters whether you committed the murder in Jasper County, Indiana, or Marion County, Indiana. Another point that came to my attention, and I read it the other day in New Mexico, evidently if you come from a faith commitment such as the Catholic community, a Catholic faith commitment, and you're opposed to taking life, you are not allowed to sit on a jury because of your commitment. That seems to be unconstitutional, or at least a bishop in New Mexico is raising the constitutional question. And that's a bias, in our opinion, because those of us, and many of us, believe that it's no longer necessary to take a human life in our name. We would, if so stated, would be excluded from the jury. And finally, there should be some concern that the people defending the system in front of the commission are the people asked to carry out the process. And I guess I say, as a trained empiricist, that raises some degree of objectivity. And so I would hope, as you go forward, and I know you have many more months to spend on this matter, that there would be some kind of outside objective appraisal of the system beyond just those who carry out the act. And I've been told that that's being done in other states, such as in Nebraska and in Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you.
Blair. I am a Lutheran pastor on the staff of the Indiana-Kentucky Synod here in Indianapolis. I'm the Director of Ecumenical Relations and also the interim pastor here at First Lutheran Church downtown, not too far from here. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. Representing the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, a couple of the things I would like to share with you are some public statements that the ELCA has made on the subject that we're talking about. First, I'd like to begin with a quotation from our 1991 social statement on capital punishment. For the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, following Jesus leads to a commitment to restorative justice. The commitment means addressing the hurt of each person whose life has been touched by violent crime. Restorative justice makes the community safer for all. It is because of our church's ministry with and to people affected by violent crime that we oppose the death penalty. Executions focus on the convicted murderer, providing very little for the victim's family or anyone else whose life has been touched by the crime. Capital punishment focuses on retribution, sometimes reflecting a spirit of vengeance. Executions do not restore broken society and can actually work counter to restoration. Our church recognizes the need to protect society from people who endanger that society. Removing offenders from the general population, placing them in a secure facility, and denying them the possibility of committing further crime. Our challenge is to incapacitate offenders in a manner that limits violence and holds open the possibility of conversion and restoration. Some of the specific things that our Lutheran Church would like to say to this commission is that we do support a moratorium on the death penalty. In a June 22nd, 2000 letter from our Office of Governmental Affairs to President Clinton, we wrote, "Our biblical heritage not only gives us the obligation to ensure that justice is done, it also gives us the responsibility to speak out when injustice is done. Since 1976 in the United States, more than 640 persons have been executed. However, 87 persons on death row have had their convictions overturned and have been released. We cannot risk taking the life of one more person. We ask you to act now before any more mistakes are made." A couple of the other specifics that I would speak to briefly would be DNA testing in all violent crimes. If there is some way that that can be certain to take place. And also the elimination of the death penalty for anyone under the age of 18. I'd like to conclude with another statement from our 1991 social statement. On the basis of Scripture and the Lutheran confessions, we hold that through the divine activity of the law, God preserves creation, orders society, and promotes justice in a broken world. Conversation works through the state and other structures of society necessary for life in the present age. The state is responsible under God for the protection of its citizens and the maintenance of justice and public order. God entrusts the state with power to take human life when failure to do so constitutes a clear danger to society. However, This does not mean that governments have an unlimited right to take life, nor does it mean that governments must punish crime by death. We increasingly question whether the death penalty has been and can be administered justly. Finally, I would just like to make a personal comment. In another one of my responsibilities in our church, I am a consultant in our synod for conflict resolution. And one of the things that is just so clear in the work that I do, the importance of listening and respecting each other in the conversation and in the dialogue that takes place. And I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to listen and to continue in that dialogue and conversation. Thank you all very much.
Senator Bray, Prosecutor Bray, I guess, at one time, weren't we? My name is Dale Palmer. I'm from Plainfield in Hendricks County. And I will have a few things to say slightly out of context with what you've heard so far. In my view, the purpose of your committee is to figure out how to follow the law more fairly rather than to do away with the death penalty. I would preserve comments on whether or not we should have the death penalty to another time and place. As I understand what our governor has done, he's asked for help on how it should be done more fairly. I have tried many criminal jury trials in my time and many first-degree murder trials. One very high celebrity case with the Honorable Prosecutor Bray back in the 1960s. I don't think that whether or not the death penalty should be imposed is really a question even for the legislature or for the courts. Under our Constitution, that should be reserved to a jury of peers. And the only problem I have with the way the law is enforced today is whether or not we truly have a jury of peers when we try first-degree murder cases. For example, it is common practice in many jurisdictions in this state, although I might add not in Hendricks County, certainly in the past, because we're a Quaker county where you could not possibly get a jury without a Quaker on it anyway. But it has never been the custom in Hendricks County to exclude people necessarily from the jury. When I'm speaking of some years back now. I haven't been involved for many years, and I've been retired for many years. But I don't think, I think the problem comes when you exclude peers from the jury by selecting people who are only dedicated to the death penalty. If we will follow the Constitution and the law as it now exists and select for juries only peers and not exclude people who do not believe in the death penalty, then I suggest to you that you will very seldom have the death penalty imposed as the law now stands. The other thing I take I disagree with strongly, and that is a prosecuting attorney asking, requesting, suggesting the death penalty to a jury. I think that is presumptuous and improper. I've tried many first-degree murder trials. I never, ever once suggested to a jury what their penalty should be. In my view, that is within the province of the jury and should not involve the state of Indiana as represented by its prosecuting attorney. If you're going to have a fair trial, you select a jury of true peers, you put them in the box, and you present the evidence to them. It is not appropriate for the prosecutor to request a penalty. That's the province of the jury. I've put my remarks in written form, and I thank you very much. I think there's some things we can do to improve the jurisprudence in the state of Indiana. But I think that whether or not we should have the death penalty is a question which should be discussed in another forum at another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Reverend Bruce Patton, minister of Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I do appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you, and not only thoughts but facts. The report of the Columbia University Law School national study, that 68% of the judicial processes leading to the death penalty were flawed, is not only interesting, it's just a bit appalling. And also the very high percentage of those inmates on the death row who are African American is also disturbing. But the question that I'd like to place before you today is, what is the positive accomplishment and contribution of capital punishment, the death penalty? The facts seem to be that the states that have capital punishment have more homicides than the states that do not have capital punishment. And that must mean that capital punishment is not much of a deterrent. And it's interesting that I believe in the state of Indiana, we had, well, I'd say almost twice the rate of homicides in 1996 that the average of the states that do not have capital punishment had. It is very costly, and I think this is understandable, and it has been mentioned, to have the death penalty process, because I'm sure, as you're aware, and the U.S. Judicial Conference has made clear, the defense costs for a death penalty case are what, 4 times higher than other trials, other cases? And not only that, but I understand, if this is correct, coming from the conference, that prosecution costs in these death penalty cases are 67% higher than the defense costs. I think it's pretty well accepted that it costs more to execute a person than it does to incarcerate that person for life. So I'm raising the question, what is the contribution and the positive value of capital punishment? Is it simply the working of justice and bringing justice to a particular situation? I think it's interesting that Representative Crawford reminded us that the statement in the Indiana Constitution is that the penal code shall be based upon the principles of reformation and not vindictive justice. Reformation. Would that be a reasonable alternative for capital punishment? Would it be wise to give the opportunity for someone who has committed a heinous crime to actually find reformation in this earthly life? Maybe even to achieve forgiveness for a terrible wrong committed? It was interesting, and this is some information that was probably taken some time ago, but when it was suggested that very possibly, instead of executing someone, that person could be incarcerated and then perhaps put to work. And the wages that that person would earn would go to the victim's family. And I think that the poll that was taken here in the state was that 62% preferred that to the death penalty. Only 26% still held out for the death penalty. There must be alternatives to capital punishment that are much more of a contributive and positive nature and something that will strengthen society than the particular contribution of capital punishment, which seems so negative and does not seem to have a real positive value. So I just ask that question of you today. What is the positive contribution of capital punishment to our society? I think the facts, the statistics raise many questions concerning this particular matter. So I do thank you. I would hope that there might be included in our particular structure of justice at least a sense of desiring to reform and not just simply to impose vindictive justice. Thank you very much.
I've come here as a citizen today, a recent citizen.
Where are you from?
I'm from Canada, but I'm recently an American citizen. I'm a naturalized American citizen. So of course in Canada we don't have capital punishment. So I go along with that. I think that's I'm an abolitionist. I guess that's the term that's used down here. But I believe that a moratorium should be called right now. I'd like to pose a question to you folks here today at the Commission. If someone were to be put to death while this Commission is deliberating, how would you feel about that? I'm just wanting you to think about that a little bit because that would really bother me. If I were sitting in your place and that took place, I think that I'd be losing a lot of sleep over that. Although I'm a Canadian, I did live here. I went back to Canada. I attended Shortridge High School when I was going to school 66 as a young boy at college on 38th Street. I had a young friend. This young friend, he took me home with him, and his father was a judge, a Supreme Court justice here. Now, I'm not going to name names. I don't want to embarrass anybody like that. However, he was a member of the KKK. And when I went back to Canada all these years, I just returned 5 years ago, I couldn't help but think all those years, what kind of justice is going on in the state right now. I'm not suggesting any Supreme Court justices or any justices now are members of the KKK. However, I wonder whether that legacy still exists. My own mother, after moving down here and associating with the people here in white society, in this society, she became an advocate of capital punishment. It was racially motivated. She thought there was a problem with a black crime, and the solution was you just kill these black criminals. So democracy is a wonderful thing. It has its flaws, and I think one of the greatest flaws is this idea of the tyranny of the majority. If I heard comments running into the election here that if any governor or any presidential candidate would say that I am opposed to the death penalty, it would be political death. Well, perhaps, maybe people are just biting their tongue. I would ask you to take your, go back to Governor O'Bannon and ask him to broaden this commission's mandate, to look at the mandate of whether or not capital punishment will be continued. But certainly, we should have a moratorium right off the bat. I was very surprised when I heard about this commission organizing that there wasn't a moratorium on the death penalty as this commission deliberated. I believe that public participation in this question should be broad. It should be statewide. There should be public hearings on, that are advertised broadly so that the public can get in on this debate. And I think it's going to be a very long and detailed and and strenuous debate, but I believe it's very necessary and ultimately very healing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Yes.
I've been urged on to say something, and of course you know that I have been here at all the meetings. I'm Sevie Badgley from Columbus, Indiana, and I'm a youth advocate specializing in parasite cases. And I would just like to go on the record that I would like to see a moratorium called. Also, when I was going through Prosecutor Stewart's statistic book, it was amazing because I was looking for children who had been given the death penalty. And I found 3, and they have all been taken off of death row now. And I'm wondering if we really want to go to the expense that it costs for all these appeals, do we really want to ever charge a child with the death penalty? I don't think so. There's too much likelihood that they can become good citizens eventually. So also, I found a picture that looked like a child, but it wasn't a child. It was a young man on page 153 of the book, Mike Lambert. And the interesting thing here to me was aggravating circumstances. He killed a law enforcement officer. Mitigating circumstances. He was 20 years old at the time, which when I was growing up, if I was 20, I was still a child. He was intoxicated at the time. Lack of guidance in upbringing, which appears in a lot of these cases. And the big thing that really bothered me was that evidently the parole officer or a psychologist or whoever had done the study said that he showed very positive signs of rehabilitation. Now, he's still on death row right now. Do we really want to kill this boy? He's a man now, but think about it. If you show positive signs of rehabilitation, should you really be killed by the state of Indiana? I don't think so. I noticed that in a few of the other cases, too. I might say that our prosecutor from Bartholomew County is here, and I've gotten bills through this group before, and I go up against Joe a few times. You know, I'm not an attorney, but he has prosecuted a few of my cases, and they're all children, and I'm very, very pleased that he has not asked for the death penalty. So anyway, that's all I have to say, but I hope that we will... Oh, one more thing. I do think that we ought to have a bill, this time in the legislative session, for DNA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for...
date in Indiana of June 27th. At your last meeting, I understand you addressed the situation about whether you should recommend to the governor that we have a moratorium in Indiana until such time as your study is complete. It's my understanding that at that time there was not a quorum and that the issue was tabled until this meeting. I'm here today to ask you to recommend to the governor that we don't kill while we are studying. The Indianapolis Star said that the study would appear to be a farce and that the public could not have any confidence in the results that you reach if we are killing while we're studying, and I ask you to take that into consideration. Mr. Lowry was convicted for the 1979 killing of 2 elderly people in Tippecanoe County outside of Lafayette. He was raised by alcoholic and abusive parents. We make no claim that Mr. Lowry is wrongly convicted, and we will not make that claim in the clemency papers that we intend to file tomorrow. He was, however, raised in a home that should give us serious pause about whether this is the sort of person that we want to be sending to death. His father was abusive, alcoholic. As an adolescent, Jim stole a neighbor's corn picker and plowed the farmer's field. His parents reported him to the police, and because at that time there was no real juvenile justice system in Indiana, the judge didn't know what to do with him. And so what he did is he committed him to the hellhole that was the Indiana mental health system. Jim was sent to Logansport, where he had numerous walkaways. It was a low-security mental health facility at that time, and Jim would routinely leave Logansport to go back to his family to try and protect his younger brothers and sisters from the hell that their father was wreaking on them. Because of those walkaways, the mental health system didn't know what to do with Jim. And so, as an adolescent, they sent him to a maximum security mental health facility known at that time as Norman Beatty. It's currently the Westville Correctional Facility. Norman Beatty makes One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest look like chump change. And everything I am about to tell you, I have found out through Norman Beatty's own reports that were filed, that are kept at the state library. Norman Beatty was supposed to be a great sort of cutting-edge mental health facility when it was built, but unfortunately the state ran out of money. And as a result of the state running out of money, they had windows that didn't close because they had intended to put air conditioning in, but because they ran out of money, they couldn't. So in the summer, what would happen is it would be stifling hot there. They had no money to hire adequate staff, and so the patients at Norman Beatty would urinate all over the place, and there was no staff to clean it up. Reporters indicated that the smell of urine and feces was overwhelming. Because there was not enough staff, and because they didn't have money to hire trained staff, they would hire whoever they could get. And some of the staff they hired were actually convicted of sexual molestation of patients. They also had at Norman Beatty, and remember, my client was sent there as an adolescent. They had about 70 or 80 juveniles there at this time. They also had what was supposed to be at that time a cutting-edge program for adult criminal sexual deviance. And in their own report, in Norman Beatty's own report, it indicates that they would let the criminal sexual deviants roam the grounds of Beatty at will, because they believed, and this is a direct quote, that it provided a good testing ground to determine whether the criminal sexual deviants were prepared to be let out on the street. If you look at the number of people on death row, you will find a staggering number of them were housed at Norman Beatty during this time. My client, as an adolescent, was made a ward worker in the lobotomy unit. And my client could describe to you vividly what that was like. It was his job to strap people down before they went into lobotomies. And he would describe to you people after the lobotomy foaming at the mouth and this sort of thing. I'm not sure how much our mental health system has changed in that time, but I know we're not using adolescents to strap people down for lobotomies. I tell you all of that not to ask you, to have some sympathy for Jim Lowry, but to give you some sense of who he is and where he came from. I would also tell you that his conduct in the 2 decades that he's been on death row has been stellar. At his post-conviction hearing, the gentleman, Roger Gast, who was in charge of the death row unit, testified at length about all of the things that Mr. Lowry has done while on death row. In fact, Mr. Gast testified that the guards' lives would be a plugged nickel without inmates like Jim Lowry. He testified that the prison could not survive without inmates like Jim Lowry. The public can simply have no confidence in any report that this commission issues if we don't stop executing people while you are completing your study. I know we executed Mr. Bivens a month or two ago, but Mr. Bivens wanted to be executed, and I do think that's a difference. Mr. Lowry will file his clemency papers tomorrow with the parole board, and he will be fighting this however and wherever he can. I would answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Opportunity to speak this morning, and thank you for undertaking the study of the situation of the death penalty in our state. The establishment of your commission came about in part because of a request made to Governor O'Bannon for a moratorium on the death penalty by our Catholic bishops of Indiana and other members of the board of the Indiana Catholic Conference. The governor's charge to this commission is less than we'd hoped for, and that concerns us for important reasons. Related to the issues which you're considering, I would submit the following. First, unquestionably, the large majority of prisoners on death row in Indiana are from minority races, and they are from the ranks of poverty. I trust that you agree that this phenomenon merits close examination as part of your study. Secondly, I would like to address the question of public expense that's involved in executing the death penalty. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, average costs of incarceration per inmate are roughly $20,000 to $21,000 annually. Costs per individual inmate for a lifetime incarceration vary depending, of course, on age, upon incarceration, and total life expectancy. But if we assume 40 years incarceration as a benchmark, the total cost of incarceration per inmate serving a life sentence would be between $800,000 and $840,000 a year. By contrast, the death penalty costs an additional $2 million per execution due to costs of trial, appeal, and other related expenses. As a religious leader in Indiana, I come before you with a deeper concern about more serious issues related to the death penalty. I'm convinced that the good of society requires that we rise to the challenge of a measured and larger vision on this troubling issue. The history of religious teaching on the death penalty through the ages demonstrates that our church has consistently asserted that the state has the authority to exact capital punishment, and in principle does so today. Crime deserves punishment in this life, and not only in the next, and the state has the authority to administer appropriate punishment to those duly judged guilty of crime. But what is appropriate punishment? That's the question posed to our contemporary society by Pope John Paul II in our church. There are four purposes of criminal punishment. Rehabilitation. The penalty should try to bring the criminal to repentance and to moral reform. Secondly, defense of society against the criminal. The government is obligated to protect society by preventing the criminal from committing additional crimes. For heinous crimes, we favor life imprisonment without parole rather than death. The third purpose is deterrence. Punishment should discourage further violence and crime. We believe life imprisonment without parole does so. There's mounting evidence that capital punishment does not deter. The fourth purpose is retribution. Punishment should try to restore the right order violated by the crime. The criminal should pay a price for the offense committed. If possible, the victims of the crime should be compensated for the wrong suffered. But this does not mean revenge. Our objections to capital punishment can be summarized as follows. The possibility that the convict may be innocent is the more common reason for opposition to the death penalty. This is matter for your commission to ascertain in our state. Secondly, the death penalty fans the claim of revenge and violence rather than foster a genuine sense of justice in society. Thirdly, capital punishment contributes dramatically to the devaluation of human life in an escalating culture of death. While pardon does not remove the obligation of justice, in our view, capital punishment seems incompatible with our faith in the teaching of Jesus. Even as our church opposes the death penalty, we do not question, in principle, the state's right to impose the death penalty. Yet we must oppose the penalty in our day because the circumstances do not warrant it. As Pope John Paul has said, as a result of steady improvements in the organization of the penal system, cases in which the execution of the offender would be absolutely necessary are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Our teaching about the state's authority does not change, but the state should not exercise its right if the evil effects outweigh the good. In recent times, witness the current McVeigh situation, the death penalty does more harm than good because it feeds a frenzy for revenge, while there is no demonstrable proof that capital punishment deters violence. Revenge neither liberates families of victims nor ennobles the victims of crime. Forgiveness liberates. To be sure, as a society, we must never forget the victims of crime and their bereaved loved ones. The truly honorable memorial is to choose life rather than death.
Thank you.
I'm Karen Burkhardt, the Indiana Death Penalty Abolition Coordinator for Amnesty International. Amnesty International opposes the death penalty under all circumstances as a violation of the right to life and the right not to be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. I have 3 areas of concern I wish to comment on. The upcoming execution, the execution of the innocent, and finally juvenile execution. First, it's unconscionable to allow the execution of another Indiana death row inmate while this study is underway. Please recommend a moratorium on executions to the governor at least until your work is completed. Secondly, the Commission's review of the capital adjudication process is pretty extensive. However, it mentioned that 2 men released from death row due to their innocence were released because major errors in their original trials allowed them to get new trials. Approximately 15% of those on death row claim to be innocent and have no recourse at this time in the court system to prove their innocence because sufficiently large errors did not occur in their trial proceedings. Why are we relying on cracks in our legal system to find innocent people? In our current judicial system, new evidence of innocence is not always sufficient to gain a new trial. Finally, the issue of juvenile execution was barely considered. The principle that children should never pay for their crimes with their lives stems from universal recognition of their immaturity and potential for rehabilitation. The use of the death penalty against child offenders violates numerous international agreements. The age limit of 18 set by international treaties is the minimum age at which a person can be held fully accountable for his or her actions. Since 1990, juvenile offenders are known to have been executed in 7 countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iran, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, here in the United States, and Yemen. The United States has killed the most juveniles. AI does not suggest in any way that juveniles convicted of serious crime be exempt from criminal liability. However, criminologists have found minors are more likely than adults to act on impulse, under the influence of others, and with little understanding of long-term consequences. Individuals under the age of 18 in Indiana are not allowed to vote in an election, drink alcohol, gamble, buy a pack of cigarettes, yet we can try them as adults and sentence them to death. Indiana has not killed a juvenile in over 80 years. There are no juveniles on death row, even though attempts have been made to prosecute juveniles for capital sentences. Indiana's last juvenile offender given the death penalty was 15 at the time of her crime. Since that time, the minimum age has been set to 16. Her death sentence was overturned by the court because it was deemed cruel and unusual punishment. She is currently serving her term of years, and tomorrow, Paula Cooper graduates from college at the women's prison. Let's not give up on our kids. Please reconsider juvenile executions in the remaining time of your study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beverly Miller.
handouts, if you would please. Some of these booklets, the booklets that she is going to hand out to you, show that 6 men on Indiana's death row can prove their innocence. If you would like to see more information on it, you can talk to their lawyers, you can talk to them themselves. They have all the papers. This basically is just part, in other words, like a tip of the iceberg. These 6 men, there is a ratio. Now, there's something to consider here. With each one of these men, if you consider there are at least 3 people in their family, you can consider a mother, a father, and either a girlfriend or a wife. You multiply that by the 6, and you have 18 people who are suffering if that person is killed. If any one of those people are killed, you have, they might have sisters, brothers, grandmothers, friends, whatever, but you are going to end up hurting someone else. There are going to be other victims. Whereas if these people, the other people that are guilty, were given all the alternative of life without parole, then you wouldn't be hurting these families by killing their loved one. Because what are you gaining? You're killing because they killed. What does that help? There's also, there's an example of that in one of these handouts is called Prison Reflections, which was from Father Joe Ross. It's about 7 pages long. It will tell you detailed the last 5 days of Gerald Viven's life, all the way through his execution. His mother, the night before, had prepared a meal for him and then went back to the hotel and tried to commit suicide. This is how these families are affected. Now, the victims' families are suffering, but if you know, they have social programs for victims' families, and basically a lot of these are free. The victims' families can go talk to someone. They have ready people from the court to listen to how they're suffering. But the accused family, especially if one of them is executed, has no one to talk to. They have to sit down and figure this out for themselves. They have to suffer through this. And this is a consideration that you need to think about. The cost that was mentioned is very true, and if you are trying to find out what cost was, you can get it on Access Indiana on the internet. It will tell you all of that. The criminal rate in the states with no death penalty is about 3.6. In states with the death penalty, it's close to 8%. When someone is executed, the crime rate goes up in that state. You also have a paper there that has a poll on the alternatives, which the front page of that is the interview that Senator Alexa gave. On the second page of that is a poll. In that poll that all the senators put out throughout the state of Indiana, the death penalty was spoken about, and people still wanted the death penalty, about 70% on the average. But the second question after that, which is down the list, states if there was an alternative of life without parole, what would they say then? The percentage went way down. It went to on the average, between 80 and 90% of the people said they would rather have the alternative, and that's speaking for the entire state of Indiana. So I'm asking you to please consider this. They would rather do that. We need the social programs for the children. The children are growing up hearing that the legislators are saying, well, we're going to keep the death penalty, and every so often, someone is being executed. This month, which is before your study is done, a man has an execution date. And I'm not speaking of Jim Lowry next month, I'm speaking of Mike Daniels. He has refused to sign the papers for federal habeas. He lays in his cell, the television is on, the covers are over his head, he does nothing. He just sits there, he doesn't want to talk to anybody. He says, and this is something that you have to consider, he's been there for so long and gone through this, gone through abuses, and he's scheduled for execution the 23rd of this month. Also, you will find there was a page is called The Official Cover-Up. In these, the former Attorney General, I believe that was Modisette, had worked on these cases and put into some of these cases things that never existed. There's proof of this, these men can prove this. There's like over 2/3 of the men on death row signed this on the last page. And it states that they will show all the evidence in it to show you that they did not either commit the crime that was in there, which I'm saying, like, one person, he put in his case, this was after the first appeal, that he had been accused of confinement. He was never accused of confinement. It's not in his transcripts. It doesn't exist. But the judges see this and they push it on through. These are things that have to be, thought over. Now, this interview, Senator Alexa, that you gave, you said that you were studying the statutes, that this commission is studying the rules and everything else. If you look in these cases, you will find in a lot of them that the rules have not been followed. You cannot actually give an honest deduction if you do not look at each case individually, and I know that's not what the governor wanted, but these are persons' lives, and they have families, and so it is very essential that perhaps you might consider looking into these cases. And in front of you, you have a 118-page booklet that has 6 men that can prove their innocence. Somewhere along the line, some of these men have mothers. Their mothers are suffering. Like the mother of Jesus Christ suffered. If you know that she suffered, then you know that a mother whose son is on death row is suffering because Jesus was given the death penalty. And that's another thought to think about. Thank you for your time.
Radiates throughout the state. Archbishop Beekline is the general chairman and will testify having to do with the conference itself. But whatever he has to say, I want you to know that I stand in solidarity with his testimony as well. My approach to today is I recognize with utmost respect each and every aspect of law enforcement, judiciary, and also the corrections positions. And my question comes not with arguing about deterrence, about innocence, about miscarriage of justice, about justice rendered, and so forth and so on. I simply would invite you, as you deliberate with your very difficult task, to keep as a backdrop the question I think we in our country and in our state must ask over and over and over again, and keep the dialogue going about it, namely, in a country such as ours, with such power, such creativity, such imagination, why is it that we must resort to the simple base act of killing another person that we might protect ourselves? I'll say that again. In a country as rich, powerful, imaginative, creative as we are, why is it that we as a state and as a country must resort to something as simple as the base act of execution to protect ourselves from criminals, even the worst of criminals in our country and in our world? So I plead with you, as taking very seriously all that you do and all that you are, and with my greatest respect to you, ask that you, in your deliberations, will keep that maybe even as a haunting question. Why is it that we must resort to this? Thank you.
Chairman Alexa and Commission members. I'm Nancy Scott, Legislative Secretary of the Indiana Friends Committee on Legislation. Indiana Friends Committee on Legislation is a 29-year-old lobby of the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers. We stand behind your effort to study the process, Indiana's process of applying the death penalty. We believe there is that of God in every person, and it is well that the state contemplate whether the process is equitable and just. However, IFCL believes no one, including the state, has the right to take the life of another. Capital punishment is irrevocable and does not take account the possibility that an error has been made or that a person can change. It brutalizes our Hoosier citizenry and perpetuates vengeance. As we have seen during this review, the process is difficult on all parties participating: victims, families, jurors, attorneys, judges, law enforcement officials, and the public at large. The financial costs involved in applying due process for death penalty cases and in applying said penalty are significant to the state. Although highly trained personnel have been gathering and analyzing data there are monumental challenges in matters such as methodology and data consistency and availability. It is a matter of record here and in other states that death row inmates are often members of the underclass who have little access to the most experienced and competent legal assistance. Quakers believe that God is the creator. We humans are neophytes, amateurs in understanding creation, including the functioning of the human brain. Will our descendants have a clearer vision of how barbaric this death penalty is? And will they feel sorrow regarding the ignorance that led us to play God through state-sanctioned killing? Let us wash our hands of this blood and ask that the governor apply a moratorium on the death penalty until such time that it can be ascertained that no innocent person is subjected to its use. This will allow more time for contemplation. Perhaps in that time, we can emphasize criminal justice system reform and restorative justice. Everything possible should be done to implement Indiana's express constitutional commitment to rehabilitation rather than vindictive justice as the goal of the criminal law.
You today. Several of you I know and greatly respect. The ones that I don't know, I'm sure you're very good people. This is a very serious task you are looking Burkhart brought up the children's issue, because I did the last time. I think it's really of the utmost of importance that we raise that age to at least 18. It would be wonderful to raise it to 21, but anyway, at least 18. The interesting thing is, if you look at the death penalty, it really doesn't deter violence. I mean, if people were going to want to kill somebody and they didn't want to die from the death penalty, they'd go to a small county that didn't have enough money to ask for the death penalty and commit the murder. They don't. They just stay where they are, commit the murder, and then some of them are unfortunate enough to be given the death penalty. So consequently, it shows right there that it doesn't deter violence. You know, it doesn't reduce our murder rate. You know, people don't look at that. Also, I'm wondering, I mean, I lobby at the State House, and I know a lot of you from that and all this. I'm wondering if we're getting too far away from this subject. I mean, maybe if everybody here went to our death row up at Michigan City and spent a couple hours talking to these people, maybe you would decide that you really didn't want to kill them. Maybe they found God since they've been on death row. That can happen. Actually, I'm from the Evangelical Lutheran Church. We have a social statement, and we are not in favor of the death penalty, but we are in favor of life imprisonment without parole, because we do realize that people do need to be protected, and some people cannot be on the streets and be safe. So consequently, you know, I would really like to see our lawmakers and people from this panel go up to death row, you know, meet with these people. You know, I just don't, the big thing is, I work as a youth advocate for abused children who have murdered their abusers. I mean, I hold my breath every time I get a new case. I've got 10 now. One's already been released, and of course he's doing very well because he's not really a violent person. But I hold my breath every time I hear of another case because I think, oh my gosh, you know, the death penalty could be given to this child, because all of my kids have committed the crime before 18. So, you know, and the one that's out's doing very well. I've got a couple others that are going to be out in the next year or two. I don't expect that there will be any trouble with them either. So, you know, I think that we really, really need to look at this thing and get connected with this thing emotionally, because as long as we sit at a table and read papers, we aren't really getting connected emotionally. And God gives life, and only God should take life. If we participate and sit back and let an execution take place, then we are saying that's okay. And in a way, we are, you know, helping to commit a murder because we didn't do anything about it. These people can get life imprisonment without parole. They are no harm to anybody. Timothy McVeigh is no harm to anybody now. And if they want to take his right to the press and all the TV and all the way, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. You know, he can just sit there. He can read books, he can write, you know what I mean? He might decide that he'd do something good, you know. But I do think that we need very, very seriously to get connected with this emotionally. I don't think we can sit in these nice buildings and have any idea of what's going on, you know, and what these people are like. I mean, it's amazing. We've got so few people that we give the death penalty to, you know, that can this possibly be right? I mean, what is it with these few people? And I think we've pretty well covered that, because a lot of times they can't afford the best attorneys and one thing and another. But anyway, I would urge you to spend some time, write a letter to one of these people, see what you get back, you know what I mean? Last time I spoke before this group too, I was worried about Michael Lambert. And Susan Carpenter is wonderful. I greatly respect her. And afterwards she said, well, you know, we did the best we could on his case, and I'm positive that she did do the best she could on his case. But the big thing is, when they did that reenactment, he's the one that had his hands cuffed behind him in a police car and supposedly shot a police officer in the front seat. Big thing is, when they did the reenactment, they didn't do the reenactment accurately because the fellow had not, who played Michael's part, was not as drunk as Michael was. So consequently, you know, I'm looking at this from the information I have, and I'm saying, you know, this fella, from what I hear, he's very sorry for what happened. He didn't remember the crime, but he feels very badly about what happened, and if he did commit it, he's sorry. So, you know, I think that somebody ought to look at this case more in depth, because if you're going to do a reenactment, everything has to be exactly the way it was. And I don't think we had that. Did we, Susan? You're not sure? Okay. But anyway, I doubt very much if this person that did the reenactment and played Michael, I doubt very much if he'd had as much to drink as Michael had. So I think that there are cases. Jim Lowry, I don't think anybody should be put to death while we're still looking at this. And I think that so that you can live better with your consciences, if you're going to let the death penalty continue, I think that you really have to get in, and that is part of your job, to get to know these people. Thank you.
I say good morning to you all, and thank you to the Commission for allowing the public to be heard. I am with the Circle City Christian Center in the Brookside Park area, and I work with at-risk youth and families dealing with poverty and oppression and hopelessness every day, all day in our fine, fair city of Indianapolis. As I was made aware of the Commission gathering and wanting to discuss issues concerning capital punishment, I just had a couple things that I jotted down as things to consider. We consider America to be one nation under God. That's what we consider it to be. And so godly principles should play in the role of our legislature, our law, and all that happens within our society. And we also share that our nation has Christian principles at the heart of it. Let me share this with you. Jesus Christ, when he came to earth, one of the first things he did was revoke the death penalty. In the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 38 and 39, Jesus said, you have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, resist not evil. If one smites you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. Why would he do such a thing? Why would he do such a thing? Because he realizes, as you all are finding out with your study, there is some complexities involved in taking someone's life, because there are mistakes that can be made. There are challenges to entering into that place of administering death. And I don't think we can fully understand what is needed as a solution to offenders if they aren't around at the end of their reformation process, for us to get inside of their heads and their hearts to find out what's the cause and what's the solution. So I think we end up doing ourselves a disservice as we administer this. And as we've seen even with the Timothy McVeigh situation, anger can be rekindled in response to the state killing offenders. And I deal with people every day, all day, that already are bent against the system. And as they deal with things that they see come across in the media as just being insensitivity to some of the particulars that are beyond their control, it can rekindle some anger within them. I'd like to look at a couple other things. The nation, America, has a history of bigotry. And in this history of bigotry, when you start talking how the nation was founded, we have issues that aren't even adequately dealt with by our own history books concerning the slaughter of Indians, concerning the imprisonment, enslavement of my people, Africans. We have so much stuff that's never really fully been dealt with. And then when the state decides to administer death, it becomes very hypocritical in the eyes of the public. I look at all the racial abuse that is kind of just swept underneath the carpet. You know, it's one thing to listen to issues, it's another thing to be a person of color that has to deal with the issues every day. Here I am, a pastor doing work in the inner city. I can walk into a store, I'm immediately a suspect. Immediately. Why? Because we have racial problems in America. When you go into a courtroom, you're still dealing with people. Judges and attorneys and people have their own assessment of who is and who isn't and who's valued and who's not. Because this is America. We're influenced by the media. We're influenced by our own upbringing. So it causes some difficulties because if we haven't dealt with the serious issues at the heart of the founding of our country, then anything else we're administering and we're laying out before the people may be tainted by those things that have been unresolved. If some of our more prominent presidents have even voiced that black people have been considered 3/5 human, that's a problem. That's a problem. That makes it easier to kill minorities. Let me ask you this. Is American blood more valuable to God than Iraqi blood? Than Mexican blood? No. It's all the same. But if we've been taught and raised in a society that sees things in a certain way, it will influence our decisions and make us insensitive to some things. We police the world of war crimes, yet have we policed the crimes that have happened in America when this nation was founded? That's amazing to me. Have we brought in Klans members and people? Do you realize that lynchings were capital punishment? Didn't even have to be a crime committed. It was just the state of our society. Have those things been resolved? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. In this culture, socioeconomics hinders our ability to render justice. In the legal system, if you can afford the attorney that has the influence and the availability and the access to the judges, you have access to justice. Lady Justice may be blind, but she can handle cash. She can know who's in front of her. And we have some serious problems that need to be considered as we're dealing with the prospect of capital punishment. There's some faulty pieces to the whole puzzle. Let me ask you this, because we know our legal system, it's broken. You got police corruption, you got special interest groups and financial bargaining that goes on, all that stuff. Let me ask you this, though. How has the ruling class in America been reformed of the blatant miscarriages of human justice when this nation was founded? There was a movie on television a couple of years ago about Thomas Jefferson not only owning slaves, but having had kids by some of the slaves. That wasn't in my history book when I was growing up. We've painted a picture that's been false, so there's a sector of society that's offended when we render judgments that are so severe because they know we've been hypocrites in our nature. One last point. The state of Indiana stands in a righteous place when administering death. A righteous place when administering death. When Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." So I encourage you to continue to study, continue to look at this thing, because there's some severe implications after this life. And I would advise you to consider those things for yourselves personally, because God is greater than all of us. Thank you.
Blair Karsh, I'm a board member of the Indiana Citizens to Abolish Capital Punishment, teacher, author, video producer in Central Indiana. I've attended a lot of your meetings and spoke in September to your public testimony, and I appreciate it. I'm going to try to keep my testimony faith upbeat and optimistic. I respect what you guys are doing and the challenges that drive you. Early February, I sent a letter to everyone on the commission, pretty articulate letter typed, asking for a response, and also severely suggesting, as I suggested at the last meeting, that a 10 a.m. meeting for the public testimony would not serve your commission or the public. I didn't get any response from anyone on the commission in any way, shape, or form. And to further emphasize that, the group here today doesn't really represent the true public. The public is bigger, wider, more, less available than the public you see here today, and I'm sort of disappointed that a letter like that and the testimony and the time of this meeting went totally unaddressed. In respect to the commission and what you guys are studying, capital punishment in Indiana, I've attended a lot of your meetings. I've attended a few of them. I've tried to attend a couple that were canceled. At times, echoed by other speakers today, to me it lacked the emotional insight and the passion that a subject like this would exemplify. I've probably seen more passion on an apartment complex going up in Fishers than I've seen in this subject. And that sort of saddens me. One person said, you guys visit death row, meet some people, put yourself in a realistic perspective, and I think the passion and the compassion would be more accessible and available to you. In regards to what you guys have studied, I've tried to study it a little bit, and echoed by the previous speakers, of course, juvenile capital punishment. That's been addressed. I work with kids every day. I'm a school teacher at about 100 schools, public and private. As I said in the last meeting, murder is the #1 subject kids want to talk about. If any of you, after this meeting, want to go interview the public, just go walk down the street, walk into a public school, meet Pastor Scott at his God lot on Brookside Avenue, and meet the kids and talk to them and understand the psychic and the personality and the illness that fills their lives and their families and their thinking full of, once again, the #1 subject the kids want to talk about.